So do you
Sounds
have any
awesome.
question, Candice, before we start, or anything you mentioned?
Yeah, I'm pretty all right. I think we'll let you do the presentation, and then whatever questions come up, because I've already asked around and nobody specified any questions.
Perfect.
So yeah, you take it away.
Okay, wonderful. And by the way, if you have any question for me during the presentation, you can write it in the chat, and Candice will monitor the chat. So either she can stop me or we can save it for the end. So welcome everyone. And let's talk about cognitive load a little bit. So the first thing I need to talk about it is a little bit how our human brain works. Because when we're talking about very good user experiences or successful product, that doesn't mean that starts with really pretty images or great feature. What really starts with is people. And to be able to create this really beautiful user experience for people, we definitely need to understand how people think, how people make decisions, and how people can choose to buy your product versus somebody else's product. So there have been obviously many decades of study about the human brain. But as far as design is concerned, I think that the contribution of Daniel Kahneman is probably one of the most important. Daniel Kahneman is an Israeli-American psychologist and economist, which is notable for his work on how people make judgment and how people make decisions, as well as behavioral economics, meaning how the human behavior is actually driven in economic field. And in fact, he won a Nobel Prize for economic science because of his work. Probably one of his most famous books is Thinking Fast and Slow. And in this book, he talks about how our brain is divided in two separate systems. So what he calls system 1 and system 2. So system 1 is basically your intuition, your instinct, anything you do unconsciously, any decision you make really fast, automatic, association you create. And according to Daniel Kahneman, and I have to say I agree, this part of our brain, the system, is actually in charge about 95% of the time. So even though for years and years and years, scientists believe that humans are very rational, they're always going to do a cost analysis, right, before making a decision, Daniel Kahneman actually mentioned that and just, showed that this is really not true. And this is not a bad thing, because system 2, or rational thinking, takes a lot of effort, is very slow, is very logical, but also very indecisive. And because we have very limited resources, is somewhat lazy in the best possible way. So it's trying to save energy. So imagine that every time you have to make a decision, you have to weigh the pros and cons. That would be impossible, because we're faced with thousands and thousands and thousands of decisions every day. So it wouldn't be possible, which is why system 1 is usually in control about 95% of the time, and system 2, or rational thinking, is in control for about 5% of the time. So now keep in mind that even when we're talking about rational thinking, the system 1 is also intervening. So it's never like pure rational thinking. Intuition, instinct, emotion, they still have a very big part in the interaction. So now, using system 2 is hard work. If you remember, every time you really have to think about a really important problem or even a purchase decision, it's a hard work. And this is why, as I mentioned, human brain trying to evolve to use the least amount of effort. So that's why he tried to work smarter and not harder. And it does that by using something called mental shortcuts. So basically, kind of rule of thumbs that your brain uses to be able to make quick decisions. One of those mental shortcuts is called mental models. So what are mental models? Mental models is basically ideas that you have about the world, about yourself, about your environment, any kind of concept you have, maybe even preconceived notion you have how things should work. And this is done so that we can understand the world. So imagine that, you had to relearn things every single time. It will take a very long time. So that means that, for example, if I go to a building where I've never been before, I'm probably going to see doors that I've never seen before. However, I know how to use a door because I used tons and tons of doors before. So I don't have to relearn how to open a door. Another thing you can consider when you're thinking about mental model is that mental model are created with experience, life experience or learned experience, as well as your own intuition, which means the mental models that each one of us have are not necessarily the same and are not necessarily correct because they're based on experience. So, but just to display these differences, imagine that you have to explain someone how to drive a car. Now, if you live in United States, like I do, most of the cars are automatic. So an automatic gear works that instead of having number gears like 1, 2, 3, 4, there's actually letter gears, and they're very basic. There is drive, there is park, there is reverse. So basically, to make a car go, all you need to do is just press the accelerator, make sure your car is in drive, and it basically will do all the work. If you live in Europe, especially in Italy, where I'm originally from, you don't use automatic car, you use manual car, which means that to actually make the car go, you had to press the clutch and you had to shift gears. Now, if I'm used to this kind of car, my mental model is going to be very different from the mental model of somebody that only lives in the United States and they only understand how automatic cars work. So now, that doesn't mean that my mental model is better or your mental model is better. It's just different, which is why it's so important when you design to talk to your customer, because you need to understand what their mental model is. You're not your customer, you don't know. So by talking to them, you can actually have an idea about, okay, what do they expect? How do they expect things to work? The other thing that System 2 is really good at is make sure that attention is selective. That means when you're focusing on a task, a really important task, you will ignore everything else if it's not related to the task. And again, this is a wonderful thing because all of us work in a noisy environment, and wherever you are, there is always a million things going on. So right now, you're probably focusing on the screen or whatever else you're doing. You're not paying attention to a dog barking in the distance or to somebody like cutting their trees or something like that. So this is why it's so important our attention is selective, so we can focus on what really matters to us. There's a couple of other things about attention that is really important to understand. The first thing is that is goal-oriented. So why we decide to pay attention to something versus something else? Well, because we all have some specific goal. And I'm not talking about high level goals like, oh, I want to lose weight next year. I'm talking about something very specific, like I have to buy, whatever, a present for Christmas. So I need to focus my attention on anything to help me achieve that goal. So we only pay attention to what matters for us. Now, this purpose, this idea about attention will be also guided by vision. So even though we have goals, we can easily be distracted, and our vision will constantly go back and forth trying to figure it out, what information is relevant for us and what information is not relevant for us. Also, attention is very short term. We are easily distracted by external or even internal stimuli. In fact, some studies said that you cannot maintain sustained attention for more than about 10 minutes. So before you get distracted, you can very quickly bring it back, but usually you get distracted easily. And one other thing about attention being selective is that when you're really focusing on something, you will ignore anything else, even if it's really, really, really obvious. So I'm sure it happened to all of you guys that when you're trying to find something, you're not going to see it even if it's in front of your face. And this is not because you're blind, like I usually tell my son, but because you're focused on something, and therefore you may miss things that are really, really obvious for you. So there are a lot of experience about that. And it's really interesting to, when you realize that, and it's really fun to notice that you're not different from anybody else. You have a selective attention. Now, for example, right now, you're probably not even listening to me and you're focusing on this really adorable puppy. Because how can you not? And I'm a cat person, but this puppy is adorable, right? So I can easily hijack your attention, both as a designer, as a regular person. But fortunately, your memory, short-term or long-term, can bring it back. And you remember, oh yeah, this is an adorable puppy, but I was actually listening to a presentation about cognitive load. And so you can easily come back to what you were doing before. So the goal as a designer is to not only capture attention, which is really, really important, but also to keep it. So you would have to make sure your customer are paying attention to you, but also you want to make sure they're not getting distracted. So how can you do that in a design sense? Well, the first way to attract attention is when you have a good contrast. So when something is brighter than other, or smaller or bigger, so any kind of contrast is really helpful to attract attention. Other things that can attract attention is like surprises and delighter. We're always looking for change. So if you ever notice like an Easter egg or something hidden in a interface that all of a sudden become obvious, we really like it. And we definitely paying attention. So friendly language is another thing that can help you pay attention, especially it's personalized. So you will notice a lot of successful websites using the word you quite a bit instead of we, just to make it more personable, more fun. And then of course, humor. Anytime you can make somebody chuckle is definitely, and laugh is definitely a really, really good idea, because then you will attract their attention. No matter how bad the humor is, you're still gonna pay attention. And now that you have the attention, how can you hold it? Well, there is a couple of things you can do to avoid distraction. The first thing is reduce motion. Don't use motion unless it's really necessary and unless it's really enhancing the user experience. Because our eyes has been trained to pay attention to anything that moves, which makes sense from an evolution standpoint, because obviously when we were in the early days of humans, you need to know if a tiger is coming up and like ready to eat you. So we're really sensitive to motion, even in our peripheral vision. So even if we're not trying to pay attention, we will be distracted. So trying to avoid things like, a scrolling ticker, for example, or really fast sliders that go really fast, because that will definitely distract. The other thing that can be a big distraction is when your interface is really cluttered, because then you don't really know what to look for, and therefore you're going to constantly scan to trying to figure it out. Okay, which one is the most important thing? Which means that you should only have one single focus, meaning don't have a lot of call to action in the same page. Just focus on what's really important and trying to make sure to attract attention to it so that I can stay there. And having a good hierarchy is also a really important thing, because a good hierarchy will draw my eye to follow a specific structure. And we are trained to see structure in anything we look at. So that's definitely really helpful. This is one example of a website that I think it does a really good job in attracting your attention and holding it. This company is called Grow Collaborative, and is a company that offers subscription for products for cleaning your house, as well-being and baby and kids and pets. It's a really great company for a lot of reasons, but they also do a really good job with their website. Obviously, I'm logged in, but the first thing I see as soon as I get to the page is a friendly greeting. Hello, Tiziana. So it made me feel like I know who you are. Obviously, I'm logged in, but it's still really, really nice to have such a friendly greeting as soon as I get there. Also, it tells me exactly what's going to happen. When was my last order? When was the next order? And if you look up here, it tells me that, hey, by the way, there is a 35% off on a specific product. That's a nice surprise, and it's definitely delightful, because 35% off is a pretty good discount. There's great contrast. So as you can see, it's very obvious to be drawn, not only just, sorry. See, I want to go back to the puppy. So not only to my name, but also a very big contrast between all the different elements. I can see the picture right away. There is a lot of negative space. And of course, the language is really friendly. And then the way they maintain my attention is because the hierarchy is really important. So I can see the most important thing is the greeting. The second most important thing I notice is the sale, because the picture obviously attract attention. And so I'm reading that, hey, there is a 35% off of, of this particular products. There is no animation that is gratuitous, and it's very simple and uncluttered. And in fact, since we're talking about animation, one thing the site does exceptionally well is to use animation in the right way. So every time you click add to add a product to the cart, first of all, you see a little animation that brings the item back to the cart and add the number. But the other cool thing about it, and this goes back to surprises and delighters, is when I click on the button, even instead of just keeping add or becoming, impossible to click again, it will make a comment like, oh, that's such a great idea, or great product, or great choice. So it doesn't stay for a long time, but it's definitely something you don't expect. And trust me, I buy online a lot. And I want to say that most of the time when you buy things, they just simply add to the cart and move on. So the fact that you actually give me the little surprise is definitely something that keep my attention there. And by the way, not only they change the text, they also change the color of the button, so that we're very attuned to see differences. So I immediately notice a change of color, and that drive me to read the cute message that they put on the button. So really, really nice, nice way to do that. Now, we talked about memory, that how memory help us lead attention. And so you need to understand that there are different types of memory. So there is memory that's sensory. So that means is driven by our perception. And this particular memory, in fact, some people don't even consider a memory because it's such a short-lived. It basically records any changes in our environment through our senses. So it will store sensation, is sense specific. So your vision will store specific sensation. Your hands will, show, say, particular sensation. And then it will, if it's really important, it will pass it on to one of either the working memory or long-term memory. It's interesting to see that, again, we are very sensitive to change. So if you ever held a really warm cup of coffee, you know that after a few seconds, you don't feel the heat anymore. You just get used to it because your hand, sensory memory say like, okay, we know that it's warm. We don't need to remember anymore. Let's see, there's something else important. Working memory is the second type of memory. And working memory is what used to be called short-term memory. The reason it's been changed the name to working memory is because it actually does some work. It's not just a temporary storage. It's very focused, it's very volatile. That means it doesn't last long, but it also store all the resources you need to make your, all the resources you need to work and achieve your goal. And of course, long-term memory is what we usually consider memory when we're talking about it. So it's a long-term storage, but it's also error-prone and unreliable. Why would that be unreliable if it's a long-term storage? Well, because a lot of time we think about our memory as a big organized warehouse. So we think about, okay, there is one, there is, every time there is a memory, I will store it very neatly on a shelf and it's going to be ready for me to be retrieved. In reality, our memory looks a lot more like this. So there is a bunch of stuff everywhere, and there is no order to it. And maybe when I need something, I need to look for it and maybe combine different pieces to make it come back. So our long-term memory is actually every time you think about something, you don't just replay it like a movie. You're actually trying to rebuild that connection, your neural connection that you had when the memory was created. That means every time you think about something or you remember something, you remember slightly differently. Because again, you're putting the pieces back together. So this is important to understand because that means you can rely on your customer memory to remember what parts of where things are or what the menu is saying. And you also have to know that there are 3 different flavors on long-term memory, and some of them you can actually affect. So the first type of memory is semantic. That means all the memory you learned. So everything you learn in school that you still remember, everything that you learn by experience, this is a learned memory. As a web designer, you can help your customer to create some semantic memory just by being very consistent on where you put your different elements, how your website works, so that customer will be used to and will learn how to use your website. There is also episodic memory, which we have very little control over it, because that's what you consider memories, right? That records, or you're gonna remember things that happen to you. Positive experience, negative experience, which means it's very important to make sure your customer don't have a negative experience, because they will remember for a long time. And finally is procedural. That means anything that you learned long time ago and now is autopilot. So to go back to the example of a car, you learned probably to drive a long time ago, and then you're gonna be remembering how to drive very automatically. Or you learn how to go to work, what route to go to work, you don't have to remember every time, you would automatically go in there. So if you make your website very consistent, maybe you can create some procedural memory in your customers so they will do things automatically. So how do we get back to that memory? How do we retrieve, since it's not a nice, beautiful warehouse, it's a messy garage, how can we bring back our memories? Well, there are 2 different ways in which you can bring back memory. One is called recognition, the other one is recall. Now, recognition is a lot easier because it's almost an automatic memory. So that means some kind of input, can be a sensory, can be a visual, can be a sound, trigger a somewhat related memory. And when I talk about somewhat related, that means they have to have one thing in common, which can be a really small thing. Recall, on the other hand, when you're making a conscious effort to remember something. So for example, you have an exam, you had to study for your exam, you're recalling, meaning trying to remember all that information that you crammed in the night before the exam. So just to show you kind of how recognition works. So I was driving down the street not too long ago in the freeway here in the United States, and there was a small car that was turquoise blue. Now, I don't remember which car it was exactly, but I do remember it was a very bright turquoise blue, which is very rare, at least in the United States. You don't see a lot of those cars. So just like I mentioned before, my eyes and my attention were drawn to it because it's unusual. So when I looked at it, though, a memory immediately popped in my head. And the memory that popped in my head, it was of a boombox. Now, not to age myself, but you use those to listen to cassette tapes. So when I was little, I really, really wanted a boombox for Christmas. I asked my parents and I really wanted, and I finally got it. But one thing about this boombox, it was specific, it was a bright turquoise blue. So again, this is probably not exactly the model I have, but what happened as I saw that car, an image of the boombox immediately popped in my head. It's something I haven't thought about in like, I don't know how many years. It's not something you think about it all the time, but that turquoise blue immediately brought a connection to my blue boombox. So again, it seems they're not related at all, but the color create the tie between the two. And this is what I mean for recognition. Now, once the boombox popped in my head, I'm trying to remember what year it was. Then I got this boombox. Now, sometime in the 80s, but when was it? Was 83, was 87, was 82? I have no idea. So this is what recall looks like. So recognition, it wasn't automatically pop in my head, but recall is trying to remember when that present happened. And I can tell you I completely failed because I have no idea what year it was. So that's why it's so much easier to have a recognition. So recognition is really easy, recall is really hard, which is why when you're designing your interfaces, you shouldn't force your customer to recall something. So that means you should have, for example, your navigation menu visible every single time. Don't hide it, especially on a larger screen, behind a menu, like a little icon, like a hamburger button, we call it here, the 3 different lines. Don't hide it, because that expect that you expect that your customer will remember that A, that's a menu, and 2, they actually wanted to go and look what's in there. They remember there is something they were looking for is right there. So having it in front, just open, is a lot easier for somebody to remember and also to explore. Because if you see like 5 or 6 links that will take you different pages of your website, it's more likely that you will suggest, oh yeah, maybe that's really interesting, I should go check it out. Versus if it's hidden, you're probably never gonna get to that discovery. So this is why you want to make sure you make it very easy for your customer to do that. So with all this said, what is cognitive load? Well, and why we should worry about it? Well, the goal about not having your user think is that you want to reduce this cognitive load. So cognitive load is the total amount of information that your working memory can actually handle. So all the resources, your mental effort that is required to complete a task. And I'm talking a task that's not automatic. I'm talking a task that actually require a little bit of effort. So again, you're trying to, for example, you're trying to wrap a present. So you have to put some effort into it. You have, first of all, you have to find out and remember where the wrapping paper is, what the ribbons are. You have to cut the paper, make sure it's nice and straight. You have to do all those things. And this is your mental effort, your cognitive load. Now, there's nothing wrong with cognitive load. We have cognitive load all the time. The only problem is that cognitive load remind us that our brain resources are limited. Now, the word cognitive load came from the cognitive load theory that was originally done by John Sweller, an Australian education psychologist. We actually was trying to find ways to help students retain information better. So the idea of the cognitive load nutshell is that the brain can only do so many things at once. And so when we asking somebody to do something, we should be very intentional and don't ask for too much all at once, because otherwise you will lead to overflow, right? So there are 2 things that can make cognitive load worse. Number 1, what is called intrinsic load. And this is really not too much you can do about it. This is like the inherent difficulty of a task and the necessary energy to learn and complete it. So think about any kind of subject you learn, something that was a little bit difficult for you. For me, it's math. I'm not the best person at math. So no matter how easily it's explained to me, there is an intrinsic difficulty of math, for me at least. So math is difficult. So no matter how easily you're trying to explain it to me, it's still, there is some difficulty to it. So as designer, there is really not too much we can do about it. We can just try to make it look easier, but there is some difficulties you cannot eliminate. Extraneous load, on the other hand, is anything that takes up mental resources to deal with other things that have nothing to do with the task at hand. So that could be distractions. That could be things that we can't control, like a little child asking for a question while you're trying to complete a job. But there are also a lot of things we can do as designer to eliminate at least visual distraction, so that your customer, your user, can actually focus on the task at hand without being overly taxed. So one other thing that can increase cognitive load is your emotions. Now, a lot of time we feel, again, we're not very emotional people, we're very rational, but regardless, emotion is really ruling most of the decision we're making and most of the thing we do. Now, positive effects, which means positive emotion, those are really, really important, because when you feel good and you have a positive feeling, your brain hemisphere, the 2 parts of your brain, talk to each other a lot more, which means you can come up with really creative, ideas and very innovative problem solving. You can overcome obstacles. You can even enter a state of flow, which you may have heard of, but basically is that you're so focused and happy in the process that the goal almost doesn't matter. You just enjoy the process of doing a particular task. Interesting enough, doesn't take too long or too much to induce positive effects. A picture of a puppy, for example, will be enough, unless you hate puppies, will be enough to actually bring some positive emotion. And doesn't have to be, you know, they did a lot of studies about it, that looking at happy picture, for example, can actually have a measurable effect in performance. So if you ever feel stressed out, try to look at picture of puppies or cats or kittens or whatever make you smile, because that will be enough to give you some positive experiences. On the other hand, if you have negative effects, or you're stressed or you're frustrated, what happens is your brain is really focused. There is no space for creativity. You're very, very focused on what you're trying to do. In fact, overly narrow focus. So while this can, a little bit of stress can be good when you have to prepare for an exam, you have to perform, those kind of things are good because you're focused on what you're doing. When it gets to be too bad or too much, or you get too frustrated, you notice that it's really hard to do even simple things, even things you always done without any problem. When you're frustrated or stressed out, is going to be very difficult. I don't know if I'm the only one, but I know that when I'm in the rush, I'm stressed out, I will drop things, I forget what things are. I would even have trouble doing the most mundane things. And this is because my brain is so focused with negative emotion that I can't really make a decision. So obviously, when you're designing a website, you want it to cause positive emotions. You don't want to cause negative emotion, because that would increase the negative feeling, and therefore will make it harder for your customer to do a good choice. So, and this has happened, when this has happened is because you go in overload, what is called cognitive overload. And that means that your brain does not have enough resources to deal with everything that's being thrown at it. So that means also that frustration will grow exponentially. So it's not going to go slowly up, it's just going to shoot up, and it's going to be worse and worse and worse. So how can we not do that? Or what causes overload? Well, you may be surprised, but visual complexity would actually increase the cognitive load. We're used to find patterns, and when something is really visually complex, it's very difficult for us to recognize those patterns, and once it takes more resources. Now, if you look at those two computers, they are pretty much from the same time, but one is a regular Power Mac from the late 80s, 90s, sorry, and the other one is an iMac. So you may remember, or you may have seen the design of the iMac. That was one of the first all-in-one computer, instead of having a monitor and a large box. So even though the iMac came after the first on this left, so it probably was actually, you know, more complex to use, it looks easier because visually it looks easier. And if we continue in this trend, if you look at the original iMac, or the candy color one, and the new iMac looks simpler because it's streamlined, the design is really clean, it's a flat screen. So again, even though the new iMac probably can do a lot more complicated things and is a lot more complex than the original iMac, it looks easier, and therefore it makes you feel like the tasks are actually easier. So why should you care? I mean, obviously you care about your customer, but why is that so important? Well, because when the cognitive load is excessive, when your customer is in overload, it will be causing much more bounce rate. That means it will go to your website and then leave without doing any kind of purchase. They may even spend a lot of time on your website, but they will try to figure it out what they want, and they're not going to be able, and so they're going to leave without making a purchase. There is also a decrease of conversion, meaning you want them to sign up for your newsletter or for things like that, but they're not going to be able to do that. They will feel overwhelmed, which means that they're not going to come back to your website. It's too confusing, it's too stressful, they're not going to come back. Excuse me. And then they're also going to be unable to do timely decision. They're not going to be able to choose, yes, that's what I want to do. And it will make them tired and impulsive. You probably know that when you're tired, you're not going to make the best decision, which is why sometimes people say you shouldn't make important decision at nighttime when you had the whole day to deal with, especially after a bad day. because you're too tired to make good decision, you may be impulsive. But
Mhm.
probably, I'm sorry, you have a question?
No, I was just saying it. It's
Yes. So, but probably the most important reason why you should matter is trust. The more overwhelmed your customer are, the less gonna trust you. And as you know, you don't do business with company you don't trust. Trust is essential to create a connection and to persuade visitor to answer your call to action. If I don't trust a website and I feel that I don't know if I can believe that they're gonna actually take good care of my money and my data, I'm not gonna do business with them. So, and incredibly enough, the better design and more clean interfaces actually inspire trust more than cluttering and overwhelming interfaces. In fact, beautiful websites perform better. In fact, beautiful things in general perform better than things that are cluttered or not well designed. And the reason for this is that we trust them. We think they're easier because they look easier. And therefore, we are in a better effect, positive effect, and we work harder to make sure it works. Because your first impression is that something is easy. You don't want to be wrong, right? You don't want to think like, oh, it look easy, but in reality, it's really complicated. So you work extra hard to make sure that the vision in your mind matches what actually the reality is. So very, very important that you inspire this trust. So poor design will increase the cognitive load. Unfortunately, this site called Applause Learning Resources is still alive. In fact, if you go and Google it, you'll find that it looks exactly like this. So, which is really sad because I had to use it to buy some books for my son who was learning Italian. So, and it was a painful experience. The reason being that there are so many steps to even get to where you want to go. So you will click like shop, whatever, let's say Italian books. Then it will give you different types of books. Then from there, you have to choose another type of book until you finally find what you want. Now, of course, I could use the search bar, but it's really even hard to see there is a search bar. It's like hiding all the way to the top. There is definitely overstimulation. There are tons of color, tons of button, way too many options as far as navigation is concerned. There are two different types of navigation, one on top, one on the side. It's really difficult to find pages and features, internal inconsistently design-wise. And I'm not even talking about the horrible colors combination that you can see here, because, you know, maybe just me. But all the other things is pretty obvious. And I'm sure you feel the same way. And if you want to enjoy this experience, feel free to go to Applause Learning Resources and experience on your own to see how much fun it is. Now, one other thing I want to point out is that not only there is tons of content, but it's very ambiguous. So if you look at those buttons in the middle, notice there is shop Italian, Spanish, French, German, Latin. Then there is shop teacher resources. Okay. But then you have Italian online catalog. How is that different from shop Italian? Is that the same? What is the difference? So not only there's too much, is also very, very confusing. Interesting enough, they're celebrating 30 years of customer, and honestly, it looks like this website was designed 30 years ago and never changed. So, you know, that will be kind of actually an interesting exercise if you want to practice what you learned today on take this picture, this website, and trying to make it better and make it more easy to understand. And honestly, if I look at this, it just gives me anxiety just by looking at it. Now, this is maybe an extreme case, but you're probably familiar with an interface like this. If you're using Windows 10, this is what your desktop is gonna look like. Now, obviously you can simplify, you can delete boxes or add boxes, but by default, there are tons of stuff in this interface. And when I look at it, I don't even know where to start. I probably would notice Netflix first, just because it is red and black and is one of the first things that attract my attention. All those blue boxes on the left side, I don't know what they are. I have no idea. Now, as you can probably tell, this is not my actual desktop. My desktop is way simplified because I eliminated pretty much all the boxes. But this is exactly what it looks like. So you don't want to do this because I don't even know where to start. So how do you know if your design is overwhelming? How do you know? Well, some of the question your user may ask if your design is too overwhelming is, where's the home button? Is that a link? Should I click on this? What will happen if I make an error? How do I save this? Is this an ad or is it a button? What should I do next? What happened to my data if I refresh it or I leave and come back? Now, granted, you're not in your user head to listen for this for these questions, but you're probably gonna have a very good idea of if those questions are actually answered. And if you don't, just have a nice usability test with your actual customer and make sure you see their difficulties if there are any. So, but those are very easy questions you can ask yourself and trying to figure it out. Maybe ask your significant others or your friends that they're not involved with the design if they finding what they're looking for easy or difficult. So what can we do? What can we do to help? Well, there's a lot of things you can do. So the first thing you can do, you want to keep it very simple. So when you design an interface, simpler is better. So this is the website for a snack company called Kind. He creates mainly nutritional snacks and bars. So you have no question about what to do. There is a big blue box to say how our new gifting line has just dropped. And that's pretty easy. And there is one call to action, shop now. Now, granted, it's a shopping site, but it's still way too many companies are not that focused. Also, the navigation is pretty simple, have only a few elements. Sure, shop and about us probably have a sub menu, but it's pretty easy. And then at the bottom, you have another way to navigate. So instead of just having a text navigation for people that are more visual, they will have explore our snacks, and not only detail you all snacks, nut bar, breakfast bar, they're also going to have a picture so that you can understand exactly what they're talking about. And you can see what kind of product you're going to get if you click on any of those, Also, they're showing you with the arrows that you can actually navigate left or right to see more products. And in case you don't see the arrow, there are 3 dots that tells you, hey, there are 3 screens of options. So you can go from one to the next. And obviously beautiful typography and a lot of negative space help to keep this interface simple. Now, this is again, my favorite Growth Collaborative. And it does exactly the same thing. It's very simple. There is a lot of negative space. It tells you exactly what's about, using very nice typography that's very easy to read. But even more importantly, it uses conventions. So, the shopping cart is a pretty much universal way to indicate that's a checkout. The circle with the numbers, even if it's green in this case and not red, is pretty obvious. That shows like, hey, by the way, there are 15 items in your cart, right? Also, we all used to see a box that say email address. We know exactly what that is. We know that our cart or login area usually is on the top right, and the navigation is usually either in the center or in the top left, which I strongly recommend you if you're designing for a Western public to avoid using the top right for putting your navigation, because most people are so used to see things they're not as crucial, like login and cart or whatever that is, that they will not find your navigation there. They will not even look at it because they're thinking that there's really nothing important there. And I don't know how many sites I see that have the main navigation on the top right, which is definitely making it harder for their customer to actually find it. Another thing you want to consider is to be consistent. So this is, and this is a perfect example, as I was telling you, is that probably you should avoid navigation to the right. However, because there's nothing else on the screen, it may still be visible. I still would have moved it, but at least it's the only thing floating in the screen. So Pandora, in case you're not familiar with it, is working a little bit like Spotify. So you can listen, you can buy a premium plan, or you can start listening for free. And you just enter, find artists, song, podcasts, and so on, and start playing. Now, their interface for their mobile design is exactly the same. There is no question you're on the same side. They use the same icon, and also they use convention. When you have a thumbs up and thumbs out, when you have a pause and play, those are very common symbols that we are all used to. So there is no question about what are we looking at. Another thing you want to do is to make intuitive. I really like Yumly. This is a site that will give you specialized and personalized recipes. So the fact that they're personalized is already really nice, because then you get only a recipe that you like. But even nicer is when you create your personalization, you can start out by saying, okay, is there any ingredient you don't want? Because I know that there's a lot of recipes sometimes that look delicious, but then they have tons of ingredients that either I can't eat or I don't like to eat. And not only they help me do that, they also have a little drawing, just in case you don't know what avocado means. So that makes it really, really intuitive. The only gripe I have with this site, I would say that I am intolerant to garlic, and garlic is not one of the ingredients that you can eliminate. However, it's easy enough not to put it in when you read the recipe. But other than that, I think it's pretty nice, the way they make it intuitive. Obviously, on the left side, there is a navigation, which is also pretty intuitive. Sign up or log in. There is my feed. There is meal planner. So you don't have any content, any question about it. And just in case you don't like, oh yeah, here we go. Just in case you don't like recommendations, they are particularly specifically tailored to you, you can also say don't personalize. And you can, I just noticed that, but you can add other ingredient to exclude. So if those ones is not something you care about, you can actually add more ingredients and say, no, don't show me anything. I was kind of surprised to see why would people don't want bananas in their food, but
I was surprised how you could say you wouldn't want garlic.
I know, everybody asked me that. Interesting enough, nobody really knows that, but in California, every food is done with tons of alcohol, garlic. So, and not only they're using garlic, they don't cook it, and they use garlic salt, which is concentrated. And so I never really liked garlic as much when I lived in Italy, but I wasn't intolerant until I moved here. So after moving here and living here for a little bit, now I cannot eat it at all. Well, I never had problem like this in Italy. And the Northern Italian cuisine does not have a lot of garlic, which is another thing most people don't know. And they also cook it. You don't very rarely eat raw garlic like you do it here. And so I think I just read my limit. But I get that question every time I say I'm Italian. I say I'm intolerant to garlic. I was like, what? You're Italian. You should not be intolerant to garlic. So, and it, funny enough, I met 2 other people from Northern Italy like me that became intolerant to garlic here in California. So it's not just me. It's just they're going overboard. So, but and yes,
Sorry.
no. Another thing that, I still like about the site, remember we were talking about recognition versus recall, that is so much easier to recognize. So by asking me what's my favorite cuisine, instead of just asking me put words in it, they just give me an idea like, okay, I like German, and you have a picture of what I think is like Wuster, seem like. Moroccan, you give me a kebab. Irish, you show me some kind of potato things. Japanese, they show me sushi. Cuban, they show me, I would say, chicken and rice. Hawaiian. So they give you also an image, not just, okay, Cuban. They're just like, hey, see, this is an example of what Cuban cuisine will be. And by the way, if you ever have the chance to eat Cuban pastry, don't pass it up. They're incredible. They're so good. So it's very, very easy. I don't have to remember, oh, what is like Moroccan again? I can see it just right there. right? Making it very, very nice. And he also, by the way, it reminds me, why do I want to be in this site? Because he said that I can search more than 2 million recipes. That's a lot of recipe. And notice, by the way, that even though I'm highlighting this for the recognition versus recall, notice how all those other rules I mentioned before follow here. It's very simple, it's very obvious, it's very clean. There's a lot of negative space. There is no confusion, no clutter. So even though each site has some particular thing I want to point out, they all following pretty much the same rules. Now, this, on the other hand, is not necessarily the same. I don't know if you're familiar with Slack, but Slack is a application that allow you to do kind of instant messaging with your group. So it's kind of taking the place of like email, if you will. It's much more instantaneous. But one thing I like about it is that our memory is very limited. And so one great thing that Slack does, it lets you log in just with your email. And then you can add what they call workspaces, so groups, and you can do that just with your email. And when you enter your email, all the workspaces you signed up with before will show up just with your email, which is great. Instead of having a password for each one of them, the email is enough to show you everything you join with that particular email. And it leave you obviously signed in, which is another really great thing to do. So I don't remember which site I took that login is, but I'm sure you've seen it a million times. There is a box to say, remember me. So as long as it works, that's really great, because that means that you don't have to log in with it. Unfortunately, a lot of time what happens is you click remember me and they don't remember you. And that's kind of doing the opposite. Instead of being happy that, hey, great, you remember me, so I don't have to enter my password again, you get even more frustrated because it feels like they're joking. I'm like, oh yeah, you asked me to remember me, but then you don't. So what's the point, right? But if you are able, think about your phone. Most of the application you have your phone, maybe not your bank app, but most of the application you have your phone, probably they'll keep you logged in. And there is a good reason for it, so you don't have to remember a million things. Now, you can obviously use also password software that will remember all your password for you. Most browser would allow you to save password. So all of those things are really helpful because our memory is limited. And honestly, I would rather use my memory to remember important stuff instead of 5 million passwords. So, so that's why it's really, really helpful. One other thing you can do, make it really, really clear. This is the homepage for Vimeo. I'm assuming you're familiar with it, but if it's not, it's like a video application, kind of like YouTube, where you can upload video. It's a little more on the serious side, I would say, but they have a free plan and paid plan. But even if you never met Vimeo, you don't know what Vimeo is, it simply tells you create videos in minutes. So it's pretty obvious what they do, right? And then you have join for free and see plans. Now, I wonder if you can tell which button do they want me to press. So obviously, see plans is a little more obvious and brighter and colorful than join for free, because they definitely trying to convince me that I should see their plans. I don't think this is particularly unethical, but it's definitely a little bit manipulative because Vimeo knows that a bright color would help you get people clicking it. But they definitely making clear what they're doing. And if you scroll down the page a little bit, even make it even more clear by telling you, okay, why would you create videos? What would the purpose of video? And say, hey, you can do video marketing, you can have employee communication, you can also monetize video, maybe in this case by doing yoga classes. So it's very, very obvious. In fact, a lot of time I recommend young designer or designer that, learning, UX, that there is a wonderful test to do either yourself or with your customer, is that something called the 5-second test, in which you show an interface design for 5 seconds, literally, and then you take it away and you ask the person looking at it if they can, what can they remember? And even more importantly, can't you tell who is the company and what they do and what they want you to do? Those are the 3 most important things that you should be able to tell in 5 seconds. The name of the company, what do they do, and what they want me to do. Because at the end, when people go to a website, they're asking exactly those 3 questions. What is this? What are the benefits for me? And what should I do? So if you cannot tell in 5 seconds, maybe it's time to redesign it so that you can. Because I don't know how long you wait when you see a website before going somewhere else, but I'm very close to 5 seconds. My time is important and precious, probably yours too. So within 5 seconds, I should be able to see, yes, that's the place I want to be. No, it's not the place I want to be. And I have to say, Vimeo really succeeded this test, because if you look at this for less than 5 seconds, you immediately know what's about. And he does that with simplicity, only a couple buttons, and obviously really, really big contrast. You have white over black, which is always one of the best contrasts. In fact, no matter what people say, white over black text over white background is probably the best contrast you could ever have. And the second best is black on yellow, apparently, which is why most of the alert signs and those kind of things are usually black text over yellow, a yellow background, at least here in the United States. I'm not sure how it is in Europe, but I think
I have a question for you.
Yes, please.
So yeah, I think just before I forget this one, but a research that I recently read about actually demonstrated that there was more strain on the eye for users using dark mode.
Right.
So while it is a high contrast that draws attention, it does also have a cognizant load to it.
Correct.
Cognizant?
Yeah, no, that's totally true.
Cognitive.
Because no, it's true. Because while you have text on white is the absolutely best contrast, black background with white text is a lot harder to read. Now, in this case, there is only like 1 line, so it's not, and big text, so it's not a problem. But the problem with dark mode is that the text usually is pretty small. And when you have small text that is in contrasty color with black, your eyes have to strain a lot more to actually read it. So despite what everybody says about dark mode, I personally don't like it because I do feel the extra strain. Maybe I'm not 20 anymore, but still, I found it very difficult. And again, it is being proven by study that it takes longer. Now, if you absolutely have to do that and you had to have reverse text, there's a couple of things you want to do. If you had to have a dark mode, number 1, increase the size and the thickness of the text and add a little more space between lines, because that will help the readability. And especially don't do what Apple does. If you go to the apple.com site, at least in United States, they're using a light gray over black, which is with very small text. So they make it really difficult to read for no reason whatsoever, because they could totally do white over black instead of, light gray. So you definitely want to make sure it's visible, and ask people that are over 20. Because younger people obviously have a better vision, but your website is not necessarily going to have only 20 years old. If it is, then you can do whatever you want. But in general, you have to consider the vision gets worse, even with people with perfect visions. So it gets worse with time. So you want to make sure you make it easy to everyone. So, but yeah, that's a great point, Candace. So black over white is a lot better than the other way around it. So if you can do that. And another interesting thing about cognitive load is that I just recently did, they recently did a study about students, and they noticed that student learns and retain a lot more when their textbooks are actually printed instead of digital. And this is for a variety of reasons. One is harder to read on screen. And this is for everybody, young and old. It just, your eyes get tired. Even if you have the blue light blockers or anything like that, it's just harder to read online. And 2, because we are trained not to actually read online. We skim through. And that goes for everything, including textbooks. So you don't actually read line by line, you just kind of skim through, and therefore you retain less information. So if you want to learn something, really well, I recommend to buy an actual printed book. I don't get any kickback for printing companies, but I really, really recommend it just because it is a lot easier. It's a lot easier to learn and retain with a printed book. So maybe I'm old fashioned. So,
No,
but check out those two side by side. This is the same company. The one on the right, it was up till, I would say 2018 versus the one on the left, it's just being redesigned in 2019. And notice what a huge difference that redesign makes. So the one on the right, the one till 2018, you will notice that does everything I told you not to do. There's going to be way too much content, not enough negative space, is confusing. There is no idea where to start, where to end. There are multiple navigation on top and on the bottom. There is not enough space around the text. The image is kind of squished in with the logo. It's hard to see exactly what they want you to do. I will not idea what they are. The only thing that is better in the older one is that you actually know what MAC-O means. So because it's the Montana Association of Counties, which I have no idea what that is. I guess is an association for counties in Montana. But that's the only thing. So, but at least their tagline in the new one is say we are MAC-O and we are the voice of Montana, 56 counties. So you kind of have an idea of what it is. So definitely this, but notice just by making the image bigger and they have the text a lot bigger, they have easy button. And then as you pass in the bottom part, notice that he broke it down as resources and data, your trusted services, events. So they kind of combine some of the navigation, but they also gave it a lot more space. So that is easy. It also they add a little icon, which even though they may not be super clear, even though I think those are pretty clear, they attract attention a lot more. We're way more drawn to visuals than we are to text, which makes sense. And in fact, this is why logos are so powerful, because people remember them immediately. In fact, I had a personal experience on that when my son was 2, I believe, about 2. So he could barely talk, but he could recognize logos. And it was amazing to me how like he would see them once and he will immediately recognize them. It was just crazy. He could recognize the brand of his little toy cars. They were like in the bottom of the car, black on black. He could immediately recognize the brand. He knew all the car brands, almost more than he does now, which is to me blew me away, because I know how powerful logos are, but to see a 2 or 3-year-old recognize logo without being able to read or anything, to me was like a perfect explanation of why visual are so much more important than text, because we are drawn to picture. If you think about it, the alphabet came way past after the paintings on the cave. So there must be a reason, right? We are definitely more visual than, we can actually learn. In fact, reading is a learned skills. It's not something you're born with, versus most kids will start doing some things. I wouldn't call it drawings, but they will take a crayon and start doing things when they're really little. They're not going to just start writing the alphabet. So obviously we are very, very much more drawn. There is only one thing I will say I don't like of the new redesign, and that's a very easy fix, is the contrast between the light blue and the white color. So the contrast is very, very poor, and it will make it very difficult to read. So in this particular case, what I would do, I would either get a darker blue, or because I am assuming that they want to differentiate those two buttons, change the color of the text. The text could have been a dark blue. One thing I noticed too with my students a lot is they think that you can either have black or white in their text, in their buttons. And they don't consider that it doesn't have to be black. It could be a darker color, which could be blue. or it doesn't have to be white. It could be like a really pale pink, or it could be a really pale yellow. So that's one thing I found really interesting in, young designers, is that they only have two options in their mind, only white or black.
Yeah.
Versus there is so many other options that you can use that it will work. And again, in this case, a color, a dark blue will be perfectly fine.
Yeah.
Doesn't
Well,
have to
I
be
think-
black. Excuse me. So, but yeah,
Yeah.
it's easy not to think about it.
Yeah.
So
I think that this company does seem to have a challenge with color, because
yes.
on the old interface as well,
Mhm.
you can see the colors are
Oh
not
yeah.
balanced.
Oh
So
yeah.
that is extra load on the brain, right?
Right. Right. Yeah. Like dark, there are two things in the old one that's not very, I mean, there are many things, they're not good. But one thing is, that's another thing, yes, another mistake I see a lot of young designers do. They wanted to have text over pictures. And that makes the text really difficult to read. So if you look on the right side where it say feature content, that background, it doesn't add anything because I cannot even tell what it is. It just make the text harder to read. So if you want to have an image and text, my recommendation is always to break down the box. So you have one area with the picture, one area with the text, because it's very difficult to find the perfect balance of that image and text on top, especially when image have different tones, like darker and lighter, like in this case. So it's really difficult. And another one of my big pet peeve for younger that I get with my students is and you get to see in a lot of websites, center text. Center text is incredibly difficult to read because we, in our country and in general in the Western world, we read left to right. And so if the line don't start at the same point, it's a lot harder for us to actually read it through it. It's also really bad for accessibility for people with disability. So just center your text in the box, but keep it left aligned, because it will make it so much easier to read. And it's interesting that you see it everywhere. Every website, even really professional website, you see, center text. Now, for a headline, that's perfectly fine. But for a body copy, it makes it really, really difficult, really difficult to read. So that's another thing to add to the cognitive load. And again, the code is, you may think about, well, just a little bit. Sure, a little bit here, a little bit there, then it will make it, they all add up. So the idea is to make it as simple as possible. And the last thing you can do is apply empathy. Trying to remember, you are not your user. Your user, your customer did not design the website. They don't know it as well as you do. So try to empathize with them. And my favorite way to empathize is to ask somebody who doesn't know anything about UX or design to navigate a website. My husband is an engineer and he's very tech savvy, but I can tell you, when we're looking at websites together for whatever reason, I'm a lot faster in finding what I'm looking for than he is. And this is because obviously I'm a web designer, so I know how web pages are done. And even he's really like tech savvy, is still struggling to find certain things. So if you have a friend that's not in the business or significant other, have them try your site even before you involve your customer, because you would have a very good understanding how difficult it is. And obviously usability testing is the best way to find empathy, and the best way to show your boss or your CEO how much your customers struggle. If they're like trying to resist changes, show them how much they struggle with the existing design, and maybe that will convince them, because it's always important to understand that. Now, one thing you can do too, if you need to have almost like a checklist, is to use heuristics. Now, heuristics are basically a list of rules of thumbs, basically what ideas and what you should do. Now, there are no laws or anything, but they help you have kind of a checklist to look when you design your interfaces. Now, there's a lot of different ones. There's the Travis 247 guidelines, Don Norma's 6 principle, Wayne Shanks and Barker. The most popular ones is Jacob Nielsen 10 heuristics, which I'm showing here on the left side. That again, they're almost like little rules. So for example, the first one that they have is that make sure that visibility of system status, that basically says, make sure your customer and your user have feedback at all time. They know where they are, they know what page they're looking for, they know how to get back. So this is definitely important. The second one, it will be match between the system and the real world. That, remember how we were talking about mental model? So your design should conform to the mental model. Sometime I go to website that instead of using a shopping cart, they're using a shopping bag. Now, it could be okay as long as it's recognizable. So one thing you don't want to do is to have something that does not look like a shopping bag. And I'm sorry, but I have to say that Apple is a big offender on here too, because their shopping bag is basically a square with a half circle on top of it, which for me is fine because again, I look at website all the time, but it's going to be as fine for everybody else? Maybe not. Also, it talks about giving control and freedom to the customer so they can always go back. They're talking about consistency and standards. So that means, like we were talking about, use conventions. People are used to specific symbol. Don't be creative about it. This is the thing that make people feel in control. And then obviously trying to avoid errors by making your design easy. And notice that number 6 is recognition rather than recall. So we are in agreement there. May also, make it efficient to use and aesthetic and minimalistic design. And the number 1 and 10 is kind of the one that get ignored the most, which is recognize, diagnose, and recover from error and help in documentation. The reason they're ignored is because I'm sure that a lot of you had an error on a website or something like that, and have no idea what happened. In fact, I had to say I have the same exact experience this morning when we are trying to troubleshoot the Meet, and Zoom will tell me that I couldn't share, I wasn't permitted to share my screen. No experience why, all the settings seems correct. There was no explanation either what to do or why it failed. None.
Yeah.
So that's a perfect example of what not to do, because an error or a mistake, it should tell you, 1, that there is an error, 2, what to do to go back on track, and ideally apologize and say, I'm sorry, this has happened, but this is how you can fix it. And I can tell you, if you ever seen like a really basic 404 error that just have this horrible like serif font that tell you 404 or error 500, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So, and obviously going with error prevention is make sure that there is help. And that doesn't mean have tons and tons of description of instructions, but make sure it's available if somebody needs it. And make sure that if you asking me for a very weird information in a form, you explain me, okay, I need this because 1, 2, 3. And you're lucky you live in Europe, so you don't have as much of those worries as we do in the United States. But a lot of time there is way more data collected that's really necessary. So by explaining why you need a particular piece of information, that will make my life easier, right? Oops, sorry. So how do you know if you succeeded, if you did, everything right? So somebody said this, I cannot take credit for it, but somebody said that if your grandmother or your little kid can understand it, or if your drunk friend can understand your website, then most likely than not, you did it pretty well. So I'm not saying you had to get your friend drunk and then go look at the interfaces, but if you feel that everybody could understand it from the older customer to the younger customer, then probably you did a good job. And if you really want to sum it up, don't make them think. This is not only the title of a really, really awesome book from Steve Krug, but it is a reality. Don't make the user think. And for thinking is don't make them activate system 2. That takes effort. So make sure you make it really simple, make sure you make it obvious, and make sure that the website works. Right. So if you have any question, just let us know. And like Candace mentioned at the beginning, there is a discount for you. If you're interested in having me look at your site or give you an audit, you can receive 10% off with the code Candace10. And I'm sure she will share later on all of her channels. And this is how to get in touch with me. You can book a free consultation on tdagux.com, which is under contraction, but you can book your consultation from there, or you can find me on LinkedIn. So